The Balic Scales by Heinrich Boll from Germany. Where my grandfather came from, most of the people lived by working in the flax sheds. For 5 generations, they'd been breathing in the dust which rose from the crushed flax stalks, letting themselves be killed off by slow degrees. A race of long-suffering, cheerful people who ate goat cheese, potatoes, and now and then a rabbit. In the evening, they would sit at home spinning and knitting. They sang, drank mint tea, and were happy. During the day, they would carry the flax stalks to the antiquated machines, with no protection from the dust, and at the mercy of the heat which came pouring out of the drying kilns. Each cottage contained only one bed, standing against the wall like a closet and reserved for the parents, while the children slept all round the room on benches. In the morning, the room would be filled with the odor of thin soup. On Sundays there was stew, and on feast days the children's faces would light up with pleasure as they watched the black acorn coffee turning paler and paler from the milk their smiling mother poured into their coffee mugs. The parents went off early to the flax sheds. The housework was left to the children. They would sweep the room, tidy up, wash the dishes, and peel the potatoes, precious, pale, yellow fruit, whose thin peel had to be produced afterwards to dispel any suspicion of extravagance or carelessness. As soon as the children were out of school, they had to go off into the woods and, depending on the season, gather mushrooms and herbs, woodruff and thyme, caraway, mint, and foxglove, and in summer, when they had brought in the hay from their meager fields, they gathered hayflowers. A kilo of hayflowers was worth 1 pfennig, and they were sold by the apothecaries in town for 20 pfennigs a kilo to highly strung ladies. The mushrooms were highly prized. They fetched 20 pfennigs a kilo and were sold in the shops in town for 1 mark 20. The children would crawl deep into the green darkness of the forest during the autumn when dampness drove the mushrooms out of the soil, and almost every family had its own places where it gathered mushrooms, places which were handed down in whispers from generation to generation. The woods belonged to the Balics, as well as the flax sheds, and in my grandfather's village the Balics had a chateau, and the wife of the head of the family had a little room next to the dairy where mushrooms, herbs, and hayflowers were weighed and paid for. There on the table stood the great Balic scales, an old-fashioned, ornate bronze-gilt contraption, which my grandfather's grandparents had already faced when they were children, their grubby hands holding their little baskets of mushrooms, their paper bags of hayflowers, breathlessly watching the number of weights Frau Balic had to throw on the scale before the swinging pointer came to rest exactly over the black line, that thin line of justice which had to be redrawn every year. Then Frau Balic would take the big book covered in brown leather, write down the weight, and pay out the money, pfennigs or 10 pfennig pieces, and very, very occasionally a mark. And when my grandfather was a child, there was a big glass jar of lemon drops standing there, the kind that cost 1 mark a kilo. And when Frau Balic, whichever one happened to be presiding over the little room, was in a good mood, she would put her hand into this jar and give each child a lemon drop, and the children's faces would light up with pleasure, the way they used to when on feast days their mother poured milk into their coffee mugs, milk that made their coffee turn paler and paler until it was as pale as the flaxen pigtails of the little girls. One of the laws imposed by the Balics on the village was no one was permitted to have any scales in the house. The law was so ancient that nobody gave a thought as to when and how it had arisen, and it had to be obeyed, for anyone who broke it was dismissed from the flax sheds. He could not sell his mushrooms or his thyme or his hayflower, and the power of the Balics was so far-reaching that no one in the neighboring villages would give him work either, or buy his forest herbs. But since the days when my grandfather's parents had gone out as small children to gather mushrooms and sell them in order that they might season the meat of the rich people of Prague or be baked into game pies, it had never occurred to anyone to break this law. Flour could be measured in cups, eggs could be counted, what they had spun could be measured by the yard, and besides, the old-fashioned bronze gilt, ornate Balic scales did not look as if there was anything wrong with them, and 5 generations had entrusted the swinging black pointer with what they had gone out as eager children to gather from the woods. True, there were some among these quiet people who flouted the law, poachers bent on making more money in one night than they could earn in a whole month in the flax sheds. But even these people apparently never thought of buying scales or making their own. My grandfather was the first person bold enough to test the justice of the Bailiffs, the family who lived in the chateau and drove 2 carriages, who always maintained one boy from the village while he studied theology at the seminary in Prague, the family with whom the priest played tarok every Wednesday, on whom the local reeve, in his carriage emblazoned with the imperial coat of arms, made an annual New Year's Day call, and on whom the emperor conferred a title on the first day of the year 1900. My grandfather was hardworking and smart. He crawled further into the woods than the children of his clan had crawled before him. He penetrated as far as the thicket where, according to legend, Bilgen the giant was supposed to dwell, guarding a treasure. But my grandfather was not afraid of Bilgen. He worked his way deep into the thicket, even when he was quite little, and brought out great quantities of mushrooms. He even found truffles, for which Frau Beilich paid 30 pfennigs a pound. Everything my grandfather took to the Beilichs, he entered on the back of a torn-off calendar page, every pound of mushrooms, every gram of thyme, and on the right-hand side, in his childish handwriting, he entered the amount he received for each item. He scrawled in every pfennig from the age of 7 to the age of 12, and by the time he was 12, the year 1900 had arrived. And because the Beilichs had been raised to the aristocracy by the emperor, they gave every family in the village a quarter of a pound of real coffee, the Brazilian kind. There was also free beer and tobacco for the men, and at the chateau there was a great banquet. Many carriages stood in the avenue of poplars leading from the entrance gate to the chateau. But the day before the banquet, the coffee was distributed in the little room which had housed the Beilich scales for almost 100 years, and the Beilich family was now called Beilich von Bilgen because, according to legend, Bilgen the giant used to have a great castle on the site of the present Beilich estate. My grandfather often used to tell me how he went there after school to fetch the coffee for 4 families, the Czechs, the Wiedlers, the Volhas, and his own, the Bruckers. It was the afternoon of New Year's Eve. There were the front rooms to be decorated, the baking to be done, and the families did not want to spare 4 boys and have each of them go all the way to the chateau to bring back a quarter of a pound of coffee. And so my grandfather sat on the narrow wooden bench in the little room while Gertrude, the maid, counted out the wrapped 4-ounce packages of coffee, 4 of them, and he looked at the scales and saw that the pound weight was still lying on the left-hand scale. Frau Beilich von Bilgen was busy with preparations for the banquet, and when Gertrude was about to put her hand into the jar with the lemon drops to give my grandfather one, she discovered it was empty. It was refilled once a year and held 1 kilo of the kind that cost a mark. Gertrude laughed and said, "Wait here while I get the new lot." And my grandfather waited with the 4-ounce packages, which had been wrapped and sealed in the factory, facing the scales on which someone had left the pound weight. And my grandfather took the 4 packages of coffee, put them on the empty scale, and his heart thudded as he watched the black finger of justice come to rest on the left of the black line. The scale with the pound weight stayed down, and the pound of coffee remained up in the air. His heart thudded more than if he had been lying behind a bush in the forest waiting for Bilgen the giant, and he felt in his pocket for the pebbles he always carried with him so he could use his catapult to shoot the sparrows which pecked away at his mother's cabbage plants. He had to put 3, 4, 5 pebbles besides the packages of coffee before the scales with the pound weight rose, and the pointer at last came to rest over the black line. My grandfather took the coffee from the scale, wrapped the 5 pebbles in his kerchief, and when Gertrude came back with the big kilo bag of lemon drops, which had to last for another whole year in order to make the children's faces light up with pleasure. When Gertrude let the lemon drops rattle into the glass jar, the pale little fellow was still standing there, and nothing seemed to have changed. My grandfather only took 3 of the packages, and then Gertrude looked in startled surprise at the white-faced child who threw the lemon drop onto the floor and ground it under his heel and said, "I want to see Frau Beilich." "Beilich von Bilgen, if you please," said Gertrude. "All right, Frau Beilich von Bilgen." But Gertrude only laughed at him, and he walked back to the village in the dark, took the Czechs, the Wiedlers, and the Volhas their coffee, and said he had to go see the priest. Instead, he went out into the dark night with his 5 pebbles in his kerchief. He had to walk a long way before he found someone who had scales, who was permitted to have them. No one in the villages of Blago and Bernau had any. He knew that, and he went straight through them till after 2 hours walking he reached the little town of Dielheim, where Honig the apothecary lived. From Honig's house came the smell of fresh pancakes and Honig's breath. When he opened the door to the half-frozen boy, already smelled of punch. There was a moist cigar between his narrow lips, and he clasped the boy's cold hands firmly for a moment, saying, "What's the matter? Has your father's lung got worse?" "No, I haven't come for medicine. I wanted—" My grandfather undid his kerchief, took out the 5 pebbles, held them out to Honig, and said, "I wanted to have these weighed." He glanced anxiously into Honig's face, but when Honig said nothing and did not get angry or even ask him anything, my grandfather said, "It is the amount that is short of justice." And now as he went into the warm room, my grandfather realized how wet his feet were. The snow had soaked through his cheap shoes, and in the forest the branches had showered him with snow, which was now melting, and he was tired and hungry and suddenly began to cry because he thought of the quantities of mushrooms, the herbs, the flowers which had been weighed on the scales, which were short 5 pebbles worth of justice. And when Honig, shaking his head and holding the 5 pebbles, called his wife, my grandfather thought of the generations of his parents, his grandparents, who had all had to have their mushrooms, their flowers weighed on the scales, and he was overwhelmed by a great wave of injustice, and began to sob louder than ever, and without waiting to be asked, he sat down on a chair, ignoring the pancakes, the cup of hot coffee, which nice, plump Frau Honig had put in front of him, and did not stop crying till Honig himself came out from the shop at the back, and rattling the pebbles in his hand, said in a low voice to his wife, 55 grams exactly. My grandfather walked the 2 hours home through the forest, got a beating at home, said nothing, not a single word, when he was asked about the coffee, spent the whole evening doing sums on the piece of paper on which he had written down everything he had sold to Frau Beilich, and when midnight struck, and the cannon could be heard from the chateau, and the whole village rang with shouting and laughter and the noise of rattles, when the family kissed and embraced all around, he said, into the New Year's silence, "The Beilichs owe me 18 marks and 32 pfennigs." And again he thought of all the children there were in the village, of his brother Fritz, who had gathered so many mushrooms, of his sister Ludmilla. He thought of the many hundreds of children who had all gathered mushrooms for the Beilichs and herbs and flowers, and this time he did not cry, but told his parents and brothers and sisters of his discovery. When the Beilichs von Bilgen went to High Mass on New Year's Day, their new coat of arms, a giant crouching under a fig tree, already emblazoned in blue and gold on their carriage, they saw the hard, pale faces of the people all staring at them. They had expected garlands in the village, a song in their honor, cheers and hurrahs, but the village was completely deserted as they drove through it. And in church, the pale faces of the people were turned towards them, mute and hostile. And when the priest mounted the pulpit to deliver his New Year's sermon, he sensed the chill in those otherwise quiet and peaceful faces, and he stumbled painfully through his sermon and went back to the altar drenched in sweat. And as the Beilichs von Bilgen left the church after Mass, they walked through a lane of mute, pale faces, but young Frau Beilich von Bilgen stopped in front of the children's pews, sought out my grandfather's face, pale little Franz Brucher, and asked him right there in the church, "Why didn't you take your coffee for your mother?" And my grandfather stood up and said, "Because you owe me as much money as 5 kilos of coffee would cost." But he pulled the 5 pebbles from his pocket, held them out to the young woman, and said, "This much, 55 grams, is short in every pound of your justice." And before the woman could say anything, the men and the women in the church lifted up their voices and sang, "The justice of this earth, O Lord, hath put thee to death." While the Beilichs were at church, Wilhelm Volha, the poacher, had broken into the little room, stolen the scales and the big fat leather-bound book in which had been entered every kilo of mushrooms, every kilo of hay flowers, everything bought by the Beilichs in the village, and all afternoon of that New Year's Day the men of the village sat in my great-grandparents' front room and calculated 1/10 of everything that had been bought, but when they had calculated many thousands of thalers and had still not come to an end, the Reeves gendarmes arrived, made their way into my great-grandfather's front room, shooting and stabbing as they came, and removed the scales and the book by force. My grandfather's little sister, Ludmilla, lost her life. A few men were wounded, and one of the gendarmes was stabbed to death by Wilhelm Volha, the poacher. Our village was not the only one to rebel. Blagau and Bernau did too, and for almost a week no work was done in the flax sheds. But a great many gendarmes appeared, and the men and the women were threatened with prison, and the bailiffs forced the priests to display the scales publicly in the school and demonstrate that the finger of justice swung to and fro accurately,